All right, so we're gonna get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Abby Currier, and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Coordinator here at the History Center of Olmsted County. I'm so excited to see everyone on here tonight, and I look forward to learning more this evening about the Ellerbe and Associates architectural firm. Here at the History Center of Olmsted County, we invite people to gather, socially distanced of course, and explore and examine our past as we educate ourselves about the stories of Olmsted County in southeastern Minnesota. We are so excited you have decided to join us tonight as we take a look at one of these stories. I'm getting a whole bunch of emails. Tonight, we're going to have a presentation from Ken Olson on the Ellerbe and Associates architecture firm, a very popular architecture firm that designed a number of private residences here in Rochester, which was unique for this firm. After his presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. During the presentation, please feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the chat, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. But before we can get started, I just want to go over a couple of logistical things. For tonight, we are going to keep all of you muted so that we can listen to our speaker. Like I said, if you have any questions at any point, drop them in the chat, and we will do our best to answer them at the end. We may also be putting some links into the chat throughout the night, so please make sure to keep an eye on it. Anything that we do put into the chat, we will be sure to send it out to you tomorrow morning, along with a quick survey about tonight's program. It will take less than 2 minutes to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. We also recommend watching this in presenter's view, but if you want to see everyone participating Brady Bunch style, you can do that by clicking on the presentation view button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you are joining us from an iPad, you may have to swipe a couple of times to change the view. We are recording tonight's program, so please keep that in mind. We are so excited about tonight's talk, and we hope you will continue to join us for some of our future events, where we will talk about everything from voting rights to wax models to immigrant healthcare and everything in between. These talks are one of the many great benefits to having a membership to the History Center of Olmsted County. We certainly hope that you will continue to join us for these talks, and we also hope that you will consider getting a membership to experience even more benefits. Tonight, we are joined by Ken Olson, who is the author of 5 books on the history of buildings in Rochester and the surrounding region. He has been a resident of Rochester since 1966, retiring from IBM in 1995. Currently volunteers as an architectural historian for the History Center of Olmsted County, Mayo Clinic Archives, and Assisi Heights. He also teaches classes in the Life program at RCTC on local history of buildings and the stories of those who lived and worked in them. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will allow Ken to take over.
Okay, now I got to get the view out of here. I can't see my screen. So how do I get rid of that? Oh, all I had to do was click on the thing. All right, here we are. Thank you, everybody. If this was a normal class face-to-face, I'd be thanking you for coming on this bitter, cold, and windy night. But as it is, thanks anyway for coming, and nice to go to school in your pajamas, right? So it works. Anyway, I'm here tonight to basically, I'm going to talk about this book and what's in it. But let me just talk about the book itself first. It was published in 2009, so it's been out for a while. It was published with a grant from the Ellerbe Beckett Corporation, the current name of the Ellerbe firm. And they took care of all the publishing costs and the editing, and even send a staff photographer down to shoot some photos for me. And the idea here was to commemorate their 100th anniversary in 2009. And so the only fee I got on this thing was I asked for 1,000 copies of the book to be donated to the History Center of Olmsted County. And I double checked today, and they still have lots of them there. And those can be ordered from the History Center. And I don't make a nickel off of this thing. All the proceeds go to the History Center. And so I didn't want you to think this was too crass of a commercial message, but I really like to see us support the History Center. Interestingly enough, unlike my other books, This one is not available anywhere else. The deal was that I think they published a little over 3,000 books. 1,000 of them came to the History Center, and the remainder they maintained in their storage to give to clients. So when we run out, we run out. So get them while they're hot. Okay, enough of the crass materialistic stuff. Let's talk about the good stuff. The Ellerbe Equity firm in Rochester specifically did many projects here other than just residences. And the firm was created in 1909, and I wrote the book in 2009, their 100th anniversary. They are still in existence and still going strong. Their projects in Rochester are many. And let me just say that in the book, I focus only on the residences they did here, and why that is so unique, I'll get to in a bit. But I just want you to know that all the other stuff that they've done here is just, I mean, they've done all the Mayo Clinic buildings except for two, all the major hospitals except for St. Mary's, surprisingly enough, have had Ellerbe as in their architects. But St. Mary's went their own path with some other excellent architects. And I also have a presentation on that if somebody wants to hear that in the future. The hotels, the Kahler Corporation and other hotels, I've used them. They've done hard telling how many commercial buildings in town, many churches, a number of schools, John Marshall, Kellogg, Mayo, that sort of thing. And finally, the residences. Now I'm going to spend the first portion of this thing just talking about the residences and their buildings. At the end, I will talk about why they only did residences in the city of Rochester. For all intents and purposes, they have never designed any residences elsewhere, but they did 183 in Rochester. Now, so that's kind of what led to my initial research on this thing. So I had two intentions in doing the research. First was to document and catalog these 183 projects done by the firm. And the second, and I'm going to save that for the end, to talk about the very key people in the development of these houses in the city and why they happened. Okay, so let's start by looking at a sample of what they did here. As I said, they've been in Rochester since 1910. They finally closed their office here, but they're still doing work in Rochester. They haven't done a residence since 1960, but they did the Charlton building, they did the Gonda and so forth. So they're still very much involved here. But their houses ranged from the magnificent, this is the foundation house, the William Mayo Mansion, to this little modest place that until just very recently sat right across the street from the entrance to St. Mary's Hospital. So this is kind of the gamut. This house belonged to also, the first one was Dr. Wills, of course. This house belonged to another Mayo employee, a model maker named George Little. So this is the Little house. So 180 residences, where are they? Now, if you asked anybody here about Ellerbe and where are the Ellerbe houses, they immediately leap to the conclusion that they're in the Pill Hill neighborhood. People leap to that same conclusion about Harold Crawford, another iconic architect from Rochester, that all his houses are in Pill Hill. He designed.
I don't think you're sharing your screen.
Oh. Well, let me get out of here and I'll try it. I'll get you in. I'm sorry. All right. Now I know what I got to do.
Now I can see it.
And now I've got to start it again. All right. And I will jump ahead here. Okay, and I'll quickly show you the slides, which I was talking about. So that's the book, and this is a summary of their projects. Here's Dr. Will's house. This is the magnificent example, and this is the other end of the extreme. This is the George Little house. Okay, now we're back to work. Everybody can see that, I assume.
Yep.
All right. So we're going to start. I'm going to talk about neighborhoods. I organized the residences into neighborhoods because I can kind of cluster them together, and each one kind of has a reason for existence and a different date that it came into existence. The Pill Hill neighborhood was originally known as College Hill, and it was kind of born in about 1910 when they opened it up for development. It was pretty much rural farmland, hard to believe, right on the edge of Rochester. But in 1910, it was subdivided into lots, and it became a prime place for houses for the incoming doctors and other administrators and so forth that were flocking to Rochester from elsewhere to join the new clinic that was really burgeoning in about 1910. But there are only 28 Ellerbe houses there. And I'm just going to show you a couple examples. Here, first off, here is Pill Hill. Here you see the house numbers on those streets for all these this is in the book, by the way. If you buy the book, you can give yourself a self-guided tour. But in 1989, the whole area was some 130 structures was put on the historic, it made a historic district for the National Register of Historic Places. And the boundary that you see there dotted in blue is the boundary. And you can see it's quite gerrymandered, it seems like, the way it weaves around. But the rationale for the historic district was buildings from 1910 to 1940, and those classic buildings. And so they kind of had to squiggle around to capture some of these that wouldn't have otherwise been in there. So that's the boundary rationale. Anyway, I'll show you a couple examples of the houses up there. I've already alluded to Dr. Will's house, which is in the bottom right corner. We now call that the foundation house. Will and Hattie, of course, donated the house to the clinic, and they use it as a foundation house now. The house on the upper left is on 12th Avenue, and that is or was originally the E. Star Judd house, and he was one of the original partners in Mayo. So these are just two examples. Now let's go to another neighborhood. This is interesting. This is the Quarry Hill neighborhood. And there are 3 Quarry Hills in Rochester, so don't get confused. This is not the one where the park and the nature center is. And there's another Quarry Hill where Indian Heights is. But this is another one. Quarry Hill was adjacent to Pill Hill. And there's a map that shows this better. If you know where the Plummer House is, the Plummer House sits exactly atop Quarry Hill. And we're going to look at the Plummer House here in a minute. But I have to acknowledge my friend Les Cookman, who's in the class. And Les was very thrilled when he saw the picture of his house. He lives there on the top of that hill. Les is the resident director of the Plummer House, and he's here tonight. So welcome, Les. So here's the neighborhood, and way up here at the top, where these streets come in, 12th Avenue right here. This is Pill Hill all across the top, and this is just south of Pill Hill. And way down here is Les's house. This is the Plummer House down here at the end of Plummer Lane. Now, originally, everything here that I'm kind of circling with my pointer was Dr. Plummer's estate, and quite a big acreage. After his death, his widow sold off a great deal of the land around here, and it was bought up for development. And this was originally known as Belmont Slopes, and it was a very nice subdivision. And Ellerbe placed some houses here, and they did the Plummer House, of course. But there are some other examples up here of really great Plummer houses, especially a couple that are right here on this drive, Plummer Circle that goes into the lane and the driveway into Les's place. So let's just look at a couple of examples. And here down at the lower right, of course, is the Plummer House itself, built by Dr. Henry Plummer, another original partner of the Mayos, and a key part of clinic history. In the upper left is the house on Plummer Circle, who was the childhood home of a man named John Waugh, son of Dr. John Waugh. And John Waugh is the principal of the Ellerbe company that arranged the commission for me. So I play tribute to him by showing his house. So this whole area, Pill Hill, Quarry Hill, as John was fond of putting it, and he wrote a foreword to the book, and in it he stated that that was his paper route. So, okay, we're still haven't come near accounting for 183 residences. This is a big mystery. And here's Kutzke Park. Now, if you know Rochester well, you know that Kutzke lays just to the west of downtown, and it's nice older homes, but they're modest. It's very much always was a kind of a middle-class neighborhood. It's bounded on one side by Highway 14 entering the city from the west, and on the other side by 2nd Street Southwest and St. Mary's Hospital. So it's that neighborhood in there. So you might ask, well, what was special in there, and why did you see the neighborhood? And you see there are 5 Ellerbe houses. We've already looked at one down here. That's the little house. Here's St. Mary's Hospital, but it's not officially in Kutzke, but it's close enough to count. But there are 4 other houses in here done by Ellerbe. Let's look at a couple of them. This beautiful little bungalow up here. I've always loved this house. I'm too old to move now, but if that had ever come up for sale, I think I would have put a bid down on it, because it's just a great little bungalow. House down here is the reason there are 4 Ellerbe houses in that neighborhood. And this was designed by a man named Edgar Banger. Edgar Banger was the resident manager of the Ellerbe firm here. And he was a residential designer, and he managed their office here. Their office was primarily concerned with Mayo Clinic projects in the large buildings there. Banger was by profession a very talented residential designer, and you can almost attribute every Ellerbe house here to Edgar Banger. So he happened to live there until he finally got enough wherewithal that he actually built a house in Pill Hill and lived there until he died in 1957. So Institute Hills neighborhood, that's way out now. Now we're thinking out toward Mayowood, out in the countryside. And this is the Institute Hills neighborhood. Now the history here is, of course, this is Bamber Valley Road. Here's Mayowood Drive, and you see the numbers here. Now this is Institute Road Southwest that runs up the hill, and the Institute for Research, the Mayo Institute for Research, is up there. And originally, all this property out here was part of the Institute Farms. And this was deeded to Mayo by Dr. Charlie Mayo, who owned all of this land out here. He owned, I don't know how many thousand acres Charlie Mayo owned, but he actually deeded this whole thing here for the Institute. And they had farms out here, and they raised sheep and all sorts of things. And along this street were 3 structures that were built to house members of the staff for the Institute. And we'll look at one of those. But in later years, they moved the Institute downtown into the Medical Sciences building. All the research went down there. And there still is some research being done out there, but it's a much smaller area. So the land adjacent to Institute Drive was sold off and called Mary Hills subdivision. And so now you see some other houses up here. So we're going to visit just a couple of examples here briefly. I love this. I obviously love the bungalow style. You would never find this house. I had to do it on satellite to actually find this place. I knew it existed. It's on a very narrow little lane that comes off of Institute Hills. If you find it, don't go poking around down there. I don't want you trespassing. I get away with it because I wave my Mayo badge and I get into places. But this little house was the house where the veterinarian for the Institute lived, and very nice little bungalow. The house down here is interesting. This belongs to now a retired Mayo physician, and he had it built in 1960, and it was one of the last houses done by Ellerbe in Rochester. And this is in the Mary Hills area, right adjacent. And if this house looks like a Frank Lloyd Wright house, a lot of people mistake it for one. This is probably not the best angle to make it look Wrightian. If you look at it from the street, it looks just low slung and very Wrightian. And when I was fortunate to find the doctor at home one day, and he invited me in for a glass of lemonade, and we sat on the patio and he just shared everything. This house was designed by Ellerbe, but it was designed by a young intern for Ellerbe who had come from the Taliesin Fellowship in Wisconsin and worked for about 3 years for Ellerbe. And they asked him to come and design this house for the guy. So this has Taliesin roots, though it's by Ellerbe, and it's still there. It's just a gorgeous house. All right, so moving right along. Now we're up to one. Oops, looky there, 119 houses. Hey, we're getting close to our total. How did that happen? Where are 119 Ellerbe houses? Right here. This is the Homestead Edition. And this is a very historic, architecturally historic subdivision, because this was done initially right after World War II in the 40s, right, because the Mayo Clinic owned this land. This was the original farm of William Worrell Mayo. This is where Will and Charlie grew up, on this farm. And Charlie loved farming and became a gentleman farmer. Will hated farming and wouldn't have anything to do with it. Never lived outside the city limits, except for a boat on the river. But this is the Homestead Edition. And down below that little strip you see at the bottom, I guess I could use my pointer. This is Homestead Village, and this came much later. This came in about 1960. And these are apartments. Now, what is all this housing for? Mayo residents, or fellows as they called them, which were graduate students in medicine who came on fellowships for approximately 3 years, had to have a place to live. And there just wasn't a lot of housing. So Mayo originally built a bunch of Quonset huts in the World War II timeframe and shortly before. And there were 2 large communities of these, and they were really pretty Spartan. They were what you'd expect if you were in the military or you've seen any films of World War II, you know, the Quonset huts and the huts that these guys had to live in, one step above a tent. So these things were getting pretty obsolete and they were overloaded. And all of a sudden, World War II is over, and all of a sudden new fellows are showing up to do their residencies and specialize in their specialties, and they had no place to put them. So basically what Mayo did was convert the farm, which they already owned, into this wonderful subdivision. Now, this wasn't the first planned subdivision that Ellerbe designed. Remember I showed you the Quarry Hill neighborhood, the Belmont Slopes? They actually had designed and laid out those streets too. So here they laid the streets out in this rather strange looking fashion when you see it. But when you understand the rationale for this place, then you'll understand the layout of the street and all these houses. The houses are interesting in themselves. In the book, I devote a lot of attention to this. But basically, I guess I can talk about that on the next slide, but let me finish what I was saying on this one. the houses all are on this sort of strange looking serpentine street that goes down with just one thing down through it. Some wags that know more about medicine than I do, and there's a lot of those in this city, say it looks like the caduceus, the staff with the snake going around it, which is kind of the universal symbol of medicine. You've probably seen that in military insignias and everything else, but it has a more meaning to it than that. If you notice the orientation of virtually all the houses, they're either the back of the house or the front of the house looks south. Okay. Now, what's important about that? Well, this was carefully designed to lay out so that they would get solar gain in these houses. Now, each of the houses, and I'll talk about how they did the designs for these, either has two really large windows. We'd call them almost picture windows, either in the front or the rear of the house, depending on which way the house is situated. And so in the winter, you get the full sunlight and the solar gain. And also they overhung the roof on that side of the house. So in the summertime, when the sun was higher, it would shade that window. So you didn't get it. So this was a way to augment the heating. The other nice thing about this, all the utilities were underground. There were no above ground utilities. And down, I'll use my pointer to show you what I'm talking about. Down between each row of houses in the interior here, there was a walkway. And on each walkway, there were two small playgrounds put in. There were no sidewalks in front of the house. So children could go out and play, go out the back door and go out and play without ever having to go across the street. And it's a brilliant design job by the Ellerbe firm. This was a time when the monsters, Levittown in New York with all their row houses. This was the pioneer days of the mass development of cookie cutter houses and that sort of thing. And this was at the same time, but this was the first one that took advantage of a lot of the state-of-the-art techniques. Solar gain became really important and well known, especially to designers of houses in the 1970s when in the days of President Carter, when we had the fuel embargo and all of a sudden people were designing houses like underground houses and things that were thermally important, and the rest of us had to learn what R value was, and I'd never had to worry about that before. So anyway, let's look at the houses. I think they were worthy a little. I just picked a couple of examples. In the book, you'll find a lot more photos of the houses, but the houses were of two designs, or basically 4 designs. There were 2 one-story houses and 2 story-and-a-halves, okay, or 2-story houses. Each one had a small garage attached. Each one had a full basement, and they were sold to the incoming residents. Now there was a kind of a trick there because they didn't have to pay any money down, and Mayo owned the houses. So basically each one had a mortgage. And so if you were an incoming resident, an outgoing resident would probably transfer his mortgage to you. And you paid a 3% interest on the mortgage, and which was a joke even in those days. And when you left, you signed the mortgage over to the guy that was moving in the house right behind you. And Mayo got away with this until I think it was well up into the 1960s or 70s. It was after I came to town, I know, that all of a sudden the IRS said, hey, Mayo, you have to decide whether you're a nonprofit medical center or are you in the real estate business. And at that point in time, they sold off Homestead Edition to private parties. I know my wife and I were shopping for a house in 1968, and we saw one for sale out there, and I thought, oh, might be an interesting place to live. And of course, we were driving a big Oldsmobile in those days. And you remember how big the cars were in those days. And we drove up to this house. And I took one look at the garage and I says, do you mind if I pull into the garage? The house was vacant. I couldn't begin to get that Oldsmobile in that garage. And I said, no, forget this. We never even went inside, unfortunately. But you can see now what's happened is most of these garages have been turned into a summer room or a family room or a rec room. And the people just park in the drives. But now the design trick here, both of these houses, you can see the large windows and the overhanging roof. These are the feature I'm talking about. So both of these houses face south, but there are other variations on these same houses. There are 4 base houses, and they double that by saying, okay, we'll reverse the house and alternate that someplace. And then they also, each of those houses had another variation where the large windows were in the back. So this is how they got the solar gain. It's just brilliant. You see no telephone poles here. I didn't take a photograph, but up here, just a peek, you can see the lane I talked about, the little walkway that ran behind all the houses. Now, originally, there were no fences in yards. So this was to allow the children to just kind of run free and with their playmates and all this sort of thing. Now, if you walk that path, it's almost claustrophobic because everybody's got a big privacy fence that comes back to the back of their lot. And you have to be over 6 feet tall to really see over into some of the backyards. Fortunately, I have long arms and a digital camera. All right, anyway, so that's Homestead Edition. Soldiers Field neighborhood, I just kind of coined that term because here's Pill Hill, right in here. And I have a friend who lives on this street right here. And he refers to this as Headache Flats, not Pill Hill, but Headache Flats. But I call it the Soldiers Field subdivision because down here is the big park and golf course. But this area, starting over here in Memorial Parkway and running all the way up here to 4th Street, there are 5 Ellerbe houses right in here. These are very important because this block had the 2 houses once upon a time, had the 2 houses belonging to Will and Charlie Mayo, their first homes, and they were right in this block, but they're long gone now. And what's flagged here is the college apartments, which are now also gone since I wrote the book. So anyway, let's just look at a couple examples. Down here, this is a house that's kind of around the corner. This is a pretty modest house, beautifully done, but a very modest little house. This was done by Ellerbe over in this area. This strange looking house here is the John Kahler house, which was in the 500 block of 4th Street. It's now torn down. And it's a Mayo parking lot now, like this happened to so many of those houses up along that 4th Street area. But this house originally dated from about 1860 something, belonged to a banker. And when the banker died and the house came up in his estate, it was bought by John Kahler, the hotel owner. And he had the Ellerbe firm come in and modernize it. I also have a sketch, which I don't put in here, but that shows the house as it looked with a wrought iron fence and around it, and an old Italianate house done in 1860 something. This is the modern version, and you can see it has large windows and a big solarium and family room on here. It was quite an awesome building, and it was torn down probably in the 1960s by Mayo and put in. But this was the Kahler residence for many, many years. Okay, and now let me just quickly talk about 2 houses that were outliers that I call them other rural, but here I'm going to locate them because they're both very interesting. Up here is, you can tell this book was written before the big flood wiped out the dam at Orinoco because Lake Shady was still there. It's no longer there. It's just kind of a dry wash now that's running down through where the dam used to be. But here is this house. We're going to talk about that. I'll show you in just a second. And way down here, here's Rochester. And Here's a really interesting house that was in the country when it was built in the 1940s, but the city has grown up around it. And when I show you this house and describe it, you're going to say, whoa, wait a minute. I've lived in Rochester for many years and I never heard of such a place. Well, I'll show you where it is. All right. So the first house I want to talk about is this one at the bottom. And this is a house out at Lake Shady. And this is was the house of Harry Harwick. Harry Harwick was the head administrator at the clinic for many years, Dr. Will's right hand. And when Dr. Will died, Harry Harwick took over the Mayo Foundation, and he managed it very ably for many years until his own retirement. But on this site was a much smaller house, and that was Dr. Will's house, his summer cottage. And in the early days, before he discovered having a big boat on the Mississippi River was far more gratifying than having a fishing shack, he had a small little cabin here. And many of the originals in Mayo, like Henry Plummer and John Kahler, who was a good friend of Will and Charlie, they all had homes along this ridge along Lake Shady. And so when Dr. Will got bored with this, he basically sold it to Harry Harwick, and Harwick wanted a bigger, fancier summer home. So they tore down the old Mayo house. And the thing I love about this thing, I mentioned to somebody that I'd been doing a lot of research for the Sisters of St. Francis. And they used to have a big farm out west of town called St. Mary's Farm, a dairy farm, for their hospital. And when they tore down the old Will Mayo house, they salvaged all the lumber out of it, dragged it off to there, and they built, it says pig pens with the boards that were salvaged from the old Mayo house. The sisters are eminently practical and always. At any rate, this was the Harwick house, and it was designed probably in the very late 30s. So you can still see it as you come in from the Twin Cities on your left as you cross that bridge where Lake Shady used to be under the thing. The house at the left on the top is an interesting house. It sits on a really large property, and it's smack in the middle of Peck's Hill subdivision. It's still there. It's a long driveway that leads up to it. The city grew out around this house, and they managed to keep the property. I don't know how many acres it is, and it sits on top of a hill with one of the most magnificent views of downtown Rochester that you can find in town. And this house was built for a man named Kahneman, who was the president and manager and, the boss of Marigold Dairies. And he lived up here with his family. And this house was built for him. When the family left, it turned into other owners, but is now owned by something called the Ellerbe Foundation. And this is their Rochester chapter house. And they're I'm not quite sure what their mission is, but it's legitimate. I mean, it's a self-improvement of some sort. And they have interns that come and stay, and they live in this house for a period of time. And I managed to find it and drive up to it. I'm not going to tell you how to find it because I think they need privacy, but there's no street up to it. You have to know where the lane takes off and off a cul-de-sac down there in the Peck's Hill subdivision. And but yeah, it's still there, and it's an interesting place. I walked out to the fire ring, which one of the daughters of the original family had described to me, where the family used to picnic and look out over the city, and it's still there, that fire ring, and in use, and it's just a gorgeous view of the city. Okay, so why so many residences in Rochester were this company that never did any more? And I want to kind of explore that while I've still got a little time left. And I'll just reiterate this, that Ellerbe was and remains this non-residential design and planning. They were a big box architect, and they still are. They were more likely to do a building like the Gonda building or the original Mayo building. They did every Mayo building with two exceptions. And I won't go off on side stories of why that happened, but two exceptions. Every Mayo building on the campus was designed by the Ellerbe firm from 1914 up to the present. So why and they did no residences anywhere else. Why? Well, the answer lies in the story of four men, and I'm going to finish by just quickly telling you this. Now, the whole story of the Ellerbe firm is in the book, and I'm not going to bore you with that. And it's a fascinating story in itself, but you can find that in the book if you choose to buy it. Maybe you already own it. I don't know. Okay, the first of the big four, John Kahler. And again, I do a kind of a full biography of Mr. Kahler in the book, but his story is is interesting. But at any rate, he was, by the time the Ellerbe came to town, he was an early entrepreneur in Rochester and a hotel owner. He started by owning something called the Cook House, but he became a close friend of Will Mayo. He opened other hotels, and he really pioneered the hospitality industry in Rochester. And I don't know if it's still true, probably is, but at one time, Rochester had more hotel rooms than St. Paul and Minneapolis put together. I mean, and it's probably still pretty close. Now, of course, we're seeing lots of big motels go up, out, more outlying. But originally, there was a lot of housing downtown, and John Kahler had a lot of it, most of it. But his real skill was in finance, and he knew where every dollar in town was and who had it. And so his real skill here was the financing of many of Dr. Will's early visions, as well as building major portions of what is now downtown Rochester. And it was Kahler that brought two other major players into the story. And the first of these was a man named Garfield Schwartz. Now, Schwartz was a contractor from Wisconsin who was a general contractor for one of the biggest firms in the Midwest. And he was in Rochester to basically build a new building out at the old state hospital in Rochester. And he was scouting around for a place where he could branch off and start his own contracting firm, a very experienced contractor. But he made his reputation in Rochester by the first house he built, Charlie Mayo's Mayowood. So he had a big rep right then, and he just parlayed this into the biggest construction firm in the state for many years. And in 1910, remember I talked about College Hill and Pill Hill? That's when that was first opened for development. He bought up a majority of the lots in anticipation of a building boom, because that was going to be fueled by all these doctors coming in, and boy, did he play it right. So to provide the proper houses for the clientele that was coming in, he needed architects. These people didn't just want some contractor to come in and throw up a stock house. These people are a little more demanding. So he needed architects, and he ended up with two favorite architects. The first was Ellerbe, and we'll talk about that connection in a sec. But and later, a few years later, a local boy graduated with his master's degree from Harvard and returned to Rochester, named Harold Crawford. And Crawford was the second guy picked by Schwartz. So Schwartz would sell the lot, and he'd steer the client to one of the two architects, and they would design the houses. So here's Franklin Ellerbe. All right, so enter Ellerbe. Now, he had recently become an independent architect and engineer after working many years for the Minneapolis building inspector. And he'd established a good reputation already, not only in the Twin Cities, but in Duluth. And in 1909, when he went independent and opened his own firm, he was already well known. But he was always prospecting for work. He had a lot of contracts in South Dakota, some in Duluth, but primarily in the Twin Cities. And he came to Rochester at an instance of another architect friend, Olin Round, and the two of them traveled down and talked to Garfield Schwartz. because they heard that there was going to be a new hotel built by John Kahler, which would become the Zumbro Hotel, if you're familiar with Rochester history. So they came down and saw him. They convinced him that a new hotel, swanky hotel, needed an architect and a real engineer to design it. And so then they went to see Kahler, and Kahler says, no, Garfield's built for me before, and he does just fine. We don't need an engineer. So they convinced him. And he says, well, we'll go see Dr. Will, and he will make the decision. And this is the fourth of the four main guys, of course, is Dr. Will Mayo. And his decision was, John, spend the money and get the right building. And so he is really, as far as I'm concerned, the central figure of this story. And of course, he's the Mayo who, with his brother, a handful of other very talented surgeons, founded what is now the famous Mayo Clinic. And this sleepy little county seat in rural southern Minnesota, which in 1910 was certainly not the center of the universe, but became kind of an architectural miracle here in the middle of the rural southern Minnesota countryside. So it was his vision that evolved Mayo into a center for diagnosis, treatment, and research. And part of this vision involved the hiring and keeping key medical people from elsewhere. And one way to do this was to provide for residences that would be attractive to more esoteric tastes. Now, again, I'll refer you to the book, because if you haven't the wherewithal to buy it, the library has multiple copies, but I'd rather see you buy one from the History Center. You can contact them on their website. If you can't get in there, I'm sure they'll be glad to ship you one if you have a credit card. But the one thing I hope you read is Dr. Will's history of encouraging new doctors to build a fine house, and how he did that and put his money where his mouth was. He just was an incredible character, not only a wonderful surgeon, but a real humanitarian. So anyway, I've covered the thing, and thus endeth Century of Elegance, my book. And this now, I'm going to open it up for questions. And Abby, if you're still there, would you like me to leave the screen up so that, yeah, I guess I will, in case somebody has a question about a particular slide. That way I can go right to it.
Yeah.
I'm going to end the slideshow, I think, so it's easier for me to go and right in the PowerPoint and get the right slide if somebody wants. So, okay, do we have any questions, Abby and pending?
Yeah, so one of the first questions came in a bit earlier in the talk, and they're asking about what happened at Ellerbe after the 60s. Someone mentioned that they thought they were taken over by another huge architectural firm. So what happens after they leave Rochester?
I can address that. They didn't really leave Rochester. They closed their office here in 1960, but they are very much a presence here. So Edgar Benger, who I alluded to in the thing, if Edgar Benger hadn't been killed in an automobile accident in 1957, Ellerbe would probably still have an office here. But Benger was the moving force in that office. And they decided to, it was a little much easier to commute between Rochester and the Twin Cities in 1960 than it was in 1910. So you didn't have to buy a train ticket and wait for the train and come down and try to get the night train back. So that's what happened there. The merger that you're talking about happened in 1988, I believe. And that's why the company is now known as Ellerbe Beckett. Now, Beckett is a residential firm, and they're out of Los Angeles. And they wanted to merge with Ellerbe, and that's why the company has Ellerbe Beckett. It was not a takeover at all. It was a full partnership. And Beckett was the smaller firm, actually, that was merged in. And Ellerbe also wanted to unite with somebody who had a broader approach. And Beckett, certainly on the West Coast, is well known for their residential designs. So it's still called Ellerbe Beckett, and it's still very much Ellerbe. Ellerbe still has their office in the tall building which they designed in the Twin Cities, so near Hennepin, or near the Nicollet Mall, just a few steps from the train, fortunately. That's how I used to go back and forth. They occupy 2 entire floors of this skyscraper. They're not a small company. What are they doing these days? They're primarily involved in hospital design. They pioneered a lot of things with Methodist Hospital here. The type of layouts and stuff they use in Methodist Hospital, and those have been copied all over the world now by Ellerbe with that style of design. They do a lot of university buildings, and if the library at Notre Dame is very famous. If you watch Notre Dame football, you see Touchdown Jesus on the big library there, visible at the end, the big mosaic. That's their design. They've done many other designs for many universities. And what they're in now, what is really their big bread and butter, are modern sports stadia. And for instance, they didn't do the big fancy one when it was in Beijing, but they did one of the secondary stadiums for the Beijing Olympics a few years ago, and that just put them on the map. And they're doing stadiums now all over the place. So yeah, they're still very much a big factor. And I thought maybe the name was about to disappear. John Watt told me one time that he wasn't going to retire as long as the Ellerbe name was on the firm. And when John retired, I thought, uh-oh. And sure enough, this whole thing was acquired by another company, but they didn't displace the name. And it's still the Ellerbe firm, and it's still run by principals of the firm. Okay.
So we have another question about a specific home. Do you have any information on the Conrad Bars home at 1025 Mayowood Road?
Yes, it's in the book.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know anything about who he was or anything. I wasn't able to find much information, but there's a photograph of the house in the book, and I don't have any further research on that. I'd have to really go back into my files, and maybe I have some notes, but I certainly found him in the city directory and pinned down the address. Next question.
Could you put the slide up with the Pill Hill houses?
You want the map?
I don't know. Do we want the map?
Or
The chat just said the Pill Hill houses.
Okay, I got it. I'll get there.
Okay. And then we have a question about the architects. Did they design each home for the individuals, or did they have like a set of standard designs that they used for each neighborhood?
No, they were very much, no, they are an eclectic architect. They don't peddle their own style. The only neighborhood that follows a particular style of architecture, almost, it was the planned Homestead Edition houses. Those are all very homogeneous. But no, as you can see, the styles are all over the place. The bungalows, the colonials, if you look in the book, you really get that of what a broad thing it was. They certainly, certain neighborhoods, Pill Hill, for instance, they were all typically very fine houses. I should talk quickly here about what I call the pecking order. Ellerbe had a lot more influence with Mayo and Mayo doctors because of their work with Mayo. So they could kind of pick and choose the ones they were going to do. Because of Garfield Schwartz and his influence, that's why they were building residences here. So if you were going to buy a house in Pill Hill, build a house in Pill Hill, if your name was Mayo, or your name was Plummer, or Harwick, or one of the really big shots at the clinic, you'd have an Ellerbe house. If you were kind of Second tier big shot, you'd have a Crawford house. And that's really the pecking order of the buildings up there. Are there any style? No. No, they're all big houses. They're all custom designed for the resident. And that's true of everything except Homestead Village.
And did
Okay.
the residents have a say in what kind of style they wanted, or were they just assigned a style?
I'm sorry.
Did the people that were going to be living in these houses, did they have a say in what style they wanted their house to be?
Oh, yes. Oh,
Okay.
yes. Oh, yes. The client was always first. And Franklin Ellerbe, that was his motto. Listen to the client and give him what he wants. That was his motto. Any other questions?
All right. Is John Wall still in practice?
No, John's retired.
Okay.
He's living up in Stillwater now and enjoying life, as far as I know.
Are you aware of the Ellerbe designed home built in 1958 located on Silver Lake? One of our guests currently lives there.
On Silver Lake?
Mm-hmm.
No. If they would email me the address, I'd love to know that. I'll give the email out again if you want to. I'll welcome an email on that house. If you give me the address, and if you have a photo you even want to send, but if you don't, just send the address because I'd like to see the house. It's not the first new Ellerbe house I found since the book was published. So I will give you now my email address again. Please feel free to send me an inquiry on that particular house. So it's Allsen, my last name, ALLSEN @AOL.com. Okay. All right, next question.
When they designed the layout of Belmont Slopes, do you know why they chose that layout?
Yes, if you've driven up there, you know that's a big hill. And those streets and lanes kind of wind around the hill and go down to 10th Avenue. So it really much follows the terrain up there. And they disturb the terrain as little as possible. And and of course, that's Plummer Circle, and it kind of circles around the thing. And I suppose I could bring the map up while I'm talking about it. I think that's it. Yeah. So this whole thing here is really designed. There's a high ground here, and this is a major downslope here. And of course, this is Plummer, and this is the high point of Quarry Hill, and this is where Les Cookman's house, otherwise known as the Plummer House, sits. Okay. So, next question.
Are there any design similarities between Ellerbe's residential properties and their commercial properties? Like, were there
No.
trends that they carried between them?
Not really, for two reasons. First off, again, even if you look at the Mayo buildings downtown, you'll see that they run the gamut from, especially their original buildings, like the 1914 building, which is now gone. But they kind of ran the gamut. Henry Plummer was a great influence while he was alive on the architecture of those buildings. Dr. Willard put him in charge of the architecture committee, and he ran it very well. Henry, the one place you've heard the term form follows function. Well, Henry didn't care about the form. He cared about the function. And he designed the layout of all these buildings, even down to the examining room, which all of us have been to the Mayo Clinic. And that same design, basic design that you see in everything, including in the Gonda building and the Mayo building, that whole design and the light system, the call system for the doctors, and that was all his. But what did the outside of the building look like? Henry Plummer didn't care, just so it stood up and it was about as maintenance free as you could get. And that's always been the philosophy with Mayo. No, there is no one particular style. They will, if they do a building for a university campus and it's one of the Ivies and they're very proud of their, campus Gothic architecture, yeah, they'll do a building in that style. But if it's something else, what the client wants. So no, there is no one homogeneous style. Next question.
How long generally did it take for the architecture firm to come up with a design that the customer would approve?
It would be fairly rapidly because there are many designers. This was a very big firm up in the Twin Cities. And they also had resident designers working under Henry Benger here in the office, Edgar Benger. And so he would be assigned to go heads down on one. And the design, from design to start of construction, was usually not more than a few months, and then might take a year to complete the house. So it was pretty expeditious.
Did they prefer to design for building with stone, or like was there a specific material they preferred?
Again, it would depend on the style that the client wanted. If he wanted a colonial, mostly they would be clapboard or, the classic colonial style. But if they wanted stone, of course, Dr. Will's mansion was sitting there, beautiful stone house. And yeah, that was popular too. Remember that Rochester had a lot of limestone quarries and had three big ones. That's why there are three quarry hills in Rochester. And so there were a lot of native limestone used. Harold Crawford was the same way. He was just like the Ellerbes. It was a colonial, there'd be some clever, but stone was very popular. A lot of brick highlights in the Ellerbe houses. There's brickwork is featured. And the designs are really eclectic in a sense that, and Crawford was the same way. The houses will have some features in them that maybe don't fit the style of house. In other words, if they set out to do a Gothic or a Tudor house, there might be a iron balcony or something on that never saw light of day in an English Tudor house, but it fits. It fits. So that's talented design. Any other question on that?
How common was it to change the design as the houses were built? In your book on Harold Crawford homes, I believe you mentioned that Harold would meet customers at lunch and they would discuss, and the customer might change the design. Did the same happen with Ellerbe?
That was the case here too, I'm sure. I call it the might as well School of Architecture while we're at it. Might as well do this while we're at it. Harold Crawford, as you say, was known to go and visit the sites at noontime, and the clients would walk up the hill from the clinic at Pill Hill, and he would meet with them, and they'd walk through what was done and say, "Oh, gee, maybe we should have a bathroom here off the kitchen, or maybe there should be a pantry here." And everything else. Harold say, "Okay, back to the drawing board." And customer understood there might be a little delay in the house, but they'd get her done. Mm-hmm. And these Ellerbe guys, remember that the designer, there was a designer put in charge of each of these houses, resident in Rochester. They had a large office here, and they would come out and do the same thing, I'm sure. I've designed a lot of houses, but I haven't a number of houses, none of which are of this variety. I mean, these were pretty prosaic houses. I rarely got to visit a site, and usually when the plans were done, the people paid me, and if I was lucky, I'd be able to find the house today. I don't know if I can or not. So these guys were making a lot more money than I was too. So next question.
Louise Hanson shared that our home was designed by one of the Ellerbe architects in 1927. Back 16 years ago, we had an older gentleman who we noticed out in front of our home who was sketching it. He had been the draftsman for the project at 1219 7th Street Southwest.
Oh, I wonder who that was. Huh. No, the Ellerbes, their alumni, many of them have been to Rochester many times. The retirees. I even led one tour before I started this book and got to meet many of them, and they all seemed pretty knowledgeable about Pill Hill and had worked here. So it might have been some alumni that was, if he was an older gentleman. But did they get a copy of the sketch? That's what I want to know.
So with fewer building codes back then, with fewer building codes, I assume back then they could change things on the fly more easily.
Yes, there was not a building code in Rochester until the 1930s. And that was actually just a little incidental sideline. That first building code was drawn up by Harold Crawford and was the first code here. But yes, there were no building codes prior to 1932 or so. That doesn't mean they didn't get a quality house because they had a quality builder, Garfield Schwartz. And by the way, he built every one of these houses in Pill Hill and Quarry Hill because he owned a lot, he sold a lot, and hired the architect for the people and, built a house. Mm-hmm. So no, these are all quality houses. And that's the same thing of what you see in the houses done by Crawford the same way. I don't know how they policed this. There was no building inspector. It's hard to believe in this day and age, but there wasn't. And so these are some major structures, as you can see. Now Mayo had engineers and people, that worked with the architects, and I don't know what code they followed, but they certainly Mayo buildings stood a long time, still are standing. Next.
Did they ever include hidden passages or rooms in any of these buildings?
That wasn't an Ellerbe thing. That was a Crawford thing. He put little hidden places in houses. I've known where many of them are. I know where many of them are in Crawford houses. I've sworn myself to secrecy. I never talk about where they are. Even found one time for somebody who had a set of plans. They had told that there was a secret compartment. Now these aren't hidden rooms or secret passages, not like priest holes in old English houses. These are little places large enough to store some jewelry and some important papers. But yeah, they're tucked in. I don't know that Ellerbe ever did that. That was a Crawford tradition. Go ahead. Next question.
Why do you think Ellerbe never really pursued more residential designs in some of the other areas that they worked?
Frankly, I don't think they wanted to. They were, like I say, a big box engineering firm and design firm. And they also, by the way, got into building management. And by that, I mean, I worked with the Franciscans on some buildings that they did for them at the College of St. Teresa in the 60s. And one of the things that made them very attractive to the sisters was they did the whole 9 yards. They not only designed the building, they built them and managed the building when they were done. So that was one thing that really kept them going and still does. They're very well known for that. Did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Did Ellerbe strictly design the houses, specifically in the Homestead area, or did they also play a role in designing like the neighborhoods and the landscaping and everything?
Oh yes, all of that. That was all Ellerbe. I guess I didn't make that clear, but no, they laid out the streets, and the whole rationale for that was an entirely planned community by the architects themselves. Yeah, I've been to the architects' archives up at the university where they have all the papers, and I actually spent a whole morning up there going through just the plans and the specifications and the abstracts for all this landscaping, and everything was done by the architect. Go ahead.
How much did these homes tend to cost?
Okay, I only know this because I have a friend, architectural historian of the cities, that was fond of going. You can't find this information in Rochester. We don't keep that good of records here, but in the Twin Cities they do. And he was able to share with me the price of some houses up there. So I compare that to Rochester in the 1920s or whenever the house was built. Let me put it this way. There is a very nice big Gothic house or Tudor house in Pill Hill It was Garfield Schwartz's first house up there, and it's still there. Very handsome house on a very nice lot. And I do know that he sold it to a doctor at the clinic shortly after it was built for $25,000. I know another story about a house that's still up there, a big Tudor house that was built in the 1920s. The Dr. Will gifted a check to the cash, actually, to a young doctor that he wanted to encourage to build a house for his large family. And that house was $15,000, a gift from Dr. Will. Those are only two I really have a price on.
Okay. Let's see. If someone wanted the firm to design a private residence today, do you think they would?
Ellerbe?
Yep.
No, I doubt it. Unless they really had a connection to Ellerbe, I don't think they've done a residence since 1960 when they did that one out in the Mary Hill subdivision. I could be wrong, but Ellerbe's, you can find their website on Ellerbe Beckett and give them a call or an email and see. But I don't think they're in that business anymore.
Who built Assisi Heights and St. Mary's?
Okay, wow. The St. Mary's was hard to do in a short question.
Oh.
But a number of architects did, from the get-go, 1889, when they opened the first hospital building. And that was done by an architect from Winona. And there have just been a series of architects since then. Very important architect in the Twin Cities, Clarence Johnston, did a number of the major buildings in the 1920s and the 1930s. And after his death, they just started hiring architects from various places. The Assisi Heights, that was built at the same time the Domitilla building, the big Domitilla building was up there. Those were both done by the same firm, Magullo and Quick, out of St. Louis. And they did those two. And then further on down the line, other architectural firms did the other major buildings. And HGA was involved in the HGA Architects, which still has an office here, was involved in the Mary Bride building, that the later one in 1980. If you're really interested in the architectural history of St. Mary's, I have a 1-hour lecture on that too. If in future you might want to book me for that, I'd be glad to do it. Okay, next question.
Is the Homestead Edition on the National Register?
No, I don't believe it is. And it used to be pretty spiffy, and now some of the houses are just beautifully maintained and some not so much because they're all in private hands. Still a nice neighborhood to live in. No, I don't believe it's ever been nominated or even considered as a historic district. Go ahead.
Has anyone tried to copy the Ellerbe designs for new neighborhoods around Rochester?
No, that's interesting. There have been attempts out around Mayowood. A very famous architect, I'm trying to think of his name now. It's terrible. But at any rate, he's very well known up in the cities, and he's a modernist architect. And he had out by the Institute out there, he had a very large tract that he was going to develop into super modern houses. And at the time, it faltered and fell on deaf ears in Rochester for the plain and simple reason is, as he admitted finally, the people in Rochester have much more conservative tastes. Well, you would think somebody would be smart enough to jump in and say, hey, I'll start building Crawford houses or Ellerbe houses, but nobody has. The other reason is the cost might be prohibitive because these houses they're still building big fancy McMansions here, but they're of a different style, much larger. And the Ellerbe style, there is no Ellerbe style and there's no Crawford style. People can imitate those, but there's no examples of it that I can give you. Go ahead.
Was that architect's name David Salmela?
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
okay.
Yeah, that's it. Sorry, I had a mental lapse there. I have lots of them now.
That's okay. Paul Scanlon sent it to me, so.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
And did Ellerbe build any churches that you know of?
Yes, yes. I can name off a few in Rochester. While they were here, they did First Presbyterian is theirs. Trinity Lutheran is theirs. Off the top of my head, can't think of any others, but there are. I'd have to look at I have their master list, and I'd have to look at that too. I just never paid much attention to anything other than residences when I was doing this book, and I haven't since. But I can look it up. If somebody really wants to know, they can email me, and I'll share with them what I know.
Do you know who built St. Mary's Chapel?
Yes, very much. Which one? There were 4. You're talking about the big one that's there now. That's the 4th chapel. That was designed by Magolo and Quay. No, that was designed by Clarence Johnston. And there was a couple other consulting architects that were specialists, in Catholic liturgical architecture, but Johnston designed that one. And its predecessor was designed by a firm in Milwaukee, Braumeier and Sons. And then the 2 small chapels that preceded that one were done by the Winona architect that did the original hospital. So yeah, I know about those. And then there's a 5th one in the tower at St. Mary's, which is known as the Francis Chapel. And that was designed by the same guy that designed St. Francis Church at the same time. So he was from the Twin Cities.
Did any of their customers after the home was built decide that they didn't like or want it?
Well, certainly some of them have been sold, but the people that had them loved them. And the same with the Crawford houses. And that's why so many of these houses look original. They've had some renovation inside, perhaps 1920 bathrooms and kitchens, or you don't want to live with those if you don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
A good architect can tastefully make those additions without compromising the original style of house. And people are pretty house proud in Pill Hill and elsewhere, so they take good care of them. How am I doing? I got all the time in the world. You got more questions?
Well, I think we're going to start wrapping up here.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for coming, and really especially. And again, I put my email out there. Be careful what you send me, or I'll put you in the spam folder. But if you have any questions, I will welcome your questions, and I promise to answer, unless they're insulting. I'll probably answer those too. Anyway, again, I want to thank you all for coming. And I've done many lectures for the History Center, and but this is my first one with this series, and I hope to do many more for you. So,
yeah. I just want to thank our audience tonight for asking so many great questions, and to also thank you, Ken, our presenter, for sharing your time and expertise with us. We hope that everyone enjoyed tonight's program and that you continue to join us in the future as we discuss everything from women at war to past pandemics and so much more. Check out our website, olmstedhistory.com, to keep up to date on all of our events and programs. Additionally, as been mentioned a couple of times tonight, if you want to learn more about these and other great homes in Rochester, Ken Olson's book, A Century of Elegance, is for sale in our gift shop. So be sure to stop by and purchase a copy for yourself. I'll send a link to our website tomorrow morning. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to help us continue to offer this and other great programs, or consider becoming a member. A History Center of Olmsted County membership offers a wide variety of benefits, including access to free and reduced cost events like this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Bye now.